Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that everything you fear about death is an illusion, that the very thing we run from, the great dark unknown, is not an enemy but a friend, one we have deeply misunderstood? You see, we are all obsessed with permanence. We build cities, legacies, and identities as if we could write our names in stone on the winds of time. But the truth is, life itself is a flowing river, and death is but the moment we realize that we are the river, not the stones at its edge. Yet we fight it. Every single one of us goes through a journey of resistance before we can truly embrace this truth. Psychologists call it the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But what if these are not just stages of grief, but the stages of death itself? And what happens when we finally reach the last stage? What happens when we no longer fight it, but embrace it? That is where the real mystery begins. Stay with me, and together we will unravel the illusion of death and discover what truly lies beyond. The first stage of death is denial, our refusal to accept that we are not separate from the changing tides of existence. When we hear of death, we push it aside, pretend it won't happen to us, or act as if it is some distant event that we will deal with later. But later never comes, does it? Because death is not an event, it is happening right now. Cells are dying within you as we speak. The person you were yesterday is gone, never to return. Life is a process of continuous death, and yet here you are. When denial collapses, anger rushes in. Why me, we ask? Why must I leave this place? Why must I let go of all that I love? But let us ask, who is the I that is raging? Who is this self that demands to be eternal? Could it be that our anger at death is nothing more than the ego throwing a tantrum, realizing for the first time that it is not the master of reality? And so the ego bargains. It says, perhaps if I live a good life, I will be spared. Perhaps if I believe in the right things, I will escape the unknown. But bargaining is a trick of the mind. It is like a wave negotiating with the ocean, hoping to remain separate forever. But no matter how much it pleads, the wave will always return to the sea. When bargaining fails, depression takes its place. But this sorrow is not the end. It is the beginning of something profound. It is the moment the ego begins to dissolve, revealing the truth hidden beneath. What if death is not losing something, but returning to something we have forgotten? And then, finally, acceptance. Not a reluctant surrender, but an ecstatic realization. Death is not the end of the story. It is merely the closing of one book and the opening of another. Like a drop of water returning to the ocean, we do not disappear. We simply awaken to a truth that was always there. We were never truly separate. We were always the whole. What happens after death? The body fades, but you were never just the body. The mind quiets, but you were never just the mind. What happens after death? You do not go anywhere because, my dear friend, you were always here. The first stage of death is denial, and it is perhaps the most deceptive. It is not just the refusal to acknowledge that death is inevitable. It is the fundamental illusion that we are separate from it, that it is something that happens to others, something distant, something foreign. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to believe in permanence. We build identities, relationships, and structures as if they will last forever, clinging to them as though they are fixed, when in truth, everything is in a constant state of change. Yet when confronted with death, whether our own or that of a loved one, the mind resists, recoils, refuses to accept what it sees as the great annihilation. We push it away, we distract ourselves, we pretend we have all the time in the world. But death does not wait for acknowledgement. It moves like the silent tide, eroding the shore even when no one is watching. Every second, cells within us die and are replaced. The person we were yesterday is gone, never to return. Change is death in slow motion. Yet we do not fear it in our daily lives because we have convinced ourselves that we are continuous, that we are solid, that we are not subject to the same impermanence that governs everything else. The great irony is that denial of death is in itself a form of dying. It is the death of awareness, the refusal to see what is in front of us. But denial can only last so long. Eventually, a moment comes when the illusion cracks, when reality forces itself upon us, undeniable, unmovable. And in that moment, everything we thought we knew begins to unravel. Anger follows denial, like a storm breaking through a fragile sky. It is raw, consuming, and deeply human. When the illusion of permanence shatters, something within us rises in rebellion. Why must this happen, we demand? Why me? Why now? Why this person? It is not just anger at death. It is anger at existence itself, at a universe that dares to continue spinning while we are left to grieve, while we are forced to watch what we love slip through our fingers like sand. It is the fury of realizing that no matter how much we build, how much we cherish, how much we love, everything is destined to change. The ego, which spent its whole life believing it was in control, now finds itself powerless, and it rages against the very nature of reality. Some direct this anger toward religion, cursing the gods they once worshipped. Others turn it inward, blaming themselves for not preventing the inevitable. Some lash out at the world, finding fault in the smallest things, as if by controlling something, anything, they can regain a sense of power. But anger, for all its intensity, is still resistance. It is still the desperate attempt to hold on, to fight against a current that cannot be stopped. And yet buried within this rage is a hidden wisdom. Anger arises because we care, because we love, because something within us knows that life is precious. It is proof that we are alive, that we feel, that we have known connection. But anger, like denial, is not a place one can stay forever. Eventually, even the strongest storm must pass. And when the fire of rage burns itself out, a quieter voice begins to whisper, a voice that does not seek to fight, but to negotiate. Bargaining is the mind's desperate attempt to strike a deal with the universe, to rewrite the rules of existence, to postpone the inevitable. It is the quiet whisper of what if and if only, the pleading of a soul that is not yet ready to let go. In this stage, we try to negotiate with fate itself, believing that perhaps through some act of devotion, some unseen cosmic contract, we can delay the loss or escape it altogether. If I pray harder, maybe I will be spared. If I had been kinder, maybe this wouldn't have happened. If only I had more time, more wisdom, more control, then perhaps death could be reasoned with. This bargaining is not always religious or spiritual. Sometimes it is purely psychological. We look for patterns, for loopholes, for explanations that make sense of something that refuses to be tamed by logic. We replay the past, wondering if a different choice, a different word, a different moment could have altered the course of fate. But there is no bargaining with the inevitable. Death is not a judge to be persuaded, not a force that can be swayed by promises or regrets. It comes whether we are ready or not, indifferent to our pleas. And yet this stage is not meaningless. Bargaining in its own way is the soul's attempt to find order in chaos, to regain a sense of control in the face of something that strips us of all power. It is the final struggle of the ego before it begins to realize that control was always an illusion. When we exhaust every plea, every prayer, every desperate justification, we are left with only one truth. There is no negotiation. There is only, and from that realization, a heavier weight begins to settle in. Depression is the moment when all illusions dissolve, when the mind, exhausted from bargaining, finally looks at reality without resistance. It is the weight of knowing that no plea will change what is coming, no anger will hold back the tide, no denial will erase the truth. It is not just sadness, it is a profound stillness, an emptiness that stretches beyond words. Everything feels meaningless because in this stage, the mind begins to grasp that everything it once clung to, identity, relationships, achievements, will eventually fade. The ego, which once fought so desperately to maintain control, now finds itself stripped bare, faced with the great unknown with no more weapons to wield. And so it sinks. The world becomes quieter, color drains from experience, and a deep sorrow takes root. But this sorrow is not a failure, it is a transformation. Depression is the funeral of the self we thought we were, the mourning of the illusion of permanence. It is the moment when we stop running, stop fighting, and simply sit with the truth. And though it feels like despair, like the closing of a door, something remarkable begins to happen within it. In the absence of resistance, something stirs, a quiet awareness, a presence beyond words. When the ego stops struggling, there is space for something deeper to emerge. Depression, then, is not just an ending, it is the threshold of something new. It is the mind preparing itself for the final step, the step beyond suffering, beyond resistance, beyond self. It is the darkness before the dawn, the silence before a new understanding arises, the moment just before surrender. Acceptance is not victory, nor is it defeat. It is the quiet realization that there was never a battle to begin with. It does not come as a grand revelation, nor does it arrive with fanfare. It slips in like a gentle tide, washing over everything that was once held so tightly, softening the edges of fear, dissolving the walls that the mind built against the inevitable. Acceptance is not about welcoming death with open arms, nor is it about pretending that loss is painless. It is simply the moment when resistance ends. The mind no longer struggles to change what is unchangeable, no longer seeks to hold back the current of life. There is a deep stillness in this state, a kind of peace that does not come from answers, but from no longer needing them. The ego, which once fought so desperately against impermanence, begins to loosen its grip, and in doing so, something remarkable happens. The fear that once seemed unbearable begins to fade, not because the unknown has become known, but because it no longer needs to be. The wave realizes it was never separate from the ocean. The drop of rain understands it was never apart from the sky. The self which once defined itself by boundaries, by attachments, by a desperate clinging to identity, now begins to dissolve into something far greater. And in that dissolution, there is no loss, only expansion. There is no end, only return. Death is no longer the enemy. It is no longer even an event. It is simply a transition, a moment, a breath. And when acceptance finally arrives, the great paradox reveals itself. In letting go of life, one finally becomes truly alive. What happens after death is the question that lingers beyond all the stages, beyond denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and even acceptance. It is the question that has haunted humanity since the first conscious being looked upon the stillness of another and wondered where they had gone. But perhaps the question itself is flawed. It assumes that there was ever a separate self to begin with, that there was something that could go anywhere at all. The body dissolves, returns to the earth, becomes the soil, the air, the rain. The mind, which was never a thing but a process, a stream of thoughts and sensations, ceases its movement like a river meeting the sea. And yet something remains, not as a thing, not as an identity, but as the awareness that was always there, before names, before memories, before the illusion of self. We fear death because we believe it is the loss of something real, when in truth it is the shedding of an illusion. The drop of water does not mourn when it falls into the ocean. The wave does not resist when it returns to the sea, and neither do we when the moment comes. Because what dies was never truly separate, and what remains was never born. Perhaps after death, there is no journey, no destination, no final judgment. Perhaps there is only waking up as if from a dream, realizing that we were never lost, never apart, never anything but the great unfolding of existence itself. And when the last breath leaves the body, when the final thought fades into silence, there is no fear, no struggle, only the quiet recognition that we have been home all along. And so we arrive at the end only to realize that there was never an end at all. The journey through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance is not just the path of dying, it is the path of living. We spend our lives resisting the inevitable, fearing the unknown, clinging to the illusion of permanence, only to discover that death is not something that happens to us. It is something that has been happening all along. Every moment is a dying, a letting go, a transition from one state to another. And yet, through it all, something remains. Not the ego, not the identity, not the fleeting collection of memories we mistake for a self, but the awareness that was always there, watching, experiencing, being. In the end, what we fear most is not death itself, but the loss of control, the loss of self, the dissolution of the illusion we spent a lifetime constructing. But when we finally let go, when we surrender, we do not find darkness or nothingness, we find freedom, because what dies was never real to begin with, and what remains was never truly lost. The wave returns to the ocean, the drop merges with the rain, and we too simply flow back into the great mystery from which we came. Not an end, not a loss, but a return. And in that return there is nothing to fear, only peace, only home.